Hi guys, how are you doing? It's Megan here, yet again with another Sunday lesson for you. We are still in learning about some of the background information for the book of Acts. We've been learning about who wrote the book of Acts, who were kind of some of the main people in the book of Acts. And today we are in chapter 4, which is on page 39 of your books if you want to flip there with me right now. Today we are learning the religious and social world of the first century church. So today I'm going to invite you to dig deep in with me and learn about how Roman society was structured. What does it mean to be a Roman citizen, and how did it benefit Paul? Because Paul was a Roman citizen. We know that from the book of Acts. We're going to learn about the different classes of Rome. Who was the lower class, and who were the middle class, and who were the people that had power? And where did the church fit into all of this? These are some of the questions we're going to answer today, and I hope that you find it as interesting as I do. I invite you to take a seat and put yourself in the shoes of the people of Acts today. Be thinking of what are the similarities that you're hearing with how we live today, and what are the things that are very different. If you want to answer that question, you're welcome to email me. But today we're learning about how God, who is God? Our God is the personal God. Our God came and walked in our shoes and ate food and lived a real life. Our God associated with all of us ordinary folk, you could say. Our lesson theme is that God is the God who understands ordinary people and frees them from sin. We have a God who truly understands. So there are some words that I'm going to mention that you can see on this page 39 if you're looking down on it, but they're going to be mentioned throughout our story time today. So I'm not going to spend a ton of time reviewing the important vocabulary words, but if it's something that you want to look at beforehand, then I invite you to pause the video and you can read them through for yourself so that you know what we're talking about when we get to that section. The Old Testament and the New Testament revealed. What verse from the Old Testament speaks to our lesson today? This passage is from Isaiah 61:1, one of the prophets in the Old Testament. And it says, "The Spirit of the Sovereign Lord is on me, because the Lord has anointed me to preach good news to the poor. He has sent me to bind up the brokenhearted, to proclaim freedom for the captives, and release from darkness for the prisoners." So these verses in Isaiah 61 describe the people of the New Testament world. Many people lived in poverty. Many were slaves, and many were brokenhearted because of their harsh lives. All, whether rich or poor, were captives of sin. And this message of the gospel is that the Savior came to all people to bring good news of forgiveness of sin. And Jesus came to fulfill this passage in the Old Testament. So, I'm flipping to page 40 if you want to flip with me. And we kind of have a longer story time today, so I want to jump right into it with you guys. The religious and social world of the first century church. Imagine that you're a Christian living in one of the provincial cities of the Roman Empire. Maybe you came from a Greek family in Ephesus who became believers after hearing Paul preach about Jesus. Or maybe you're a Hellenistic Jew living in Corinth after having been banished from Rome by Emperor Claudius. A Hellenistic Jew was a Jewish person who was born a Jew but lived outside Palestine and spoke Greek instead of Aramaic. You have listened to Paul and were persuaded that Jesus of Nazareth was the Messiah prophesied about by the Old Testament prophets. Or maybe you're a slave working in the household of a wealthy Roman senator. You're fascinated to hear about being free in Christ because every day you have no choices. You've had to do what your owner tells you to do. The Christian church of the first century was a peculiar assortment of merchants and craftsmen, Jews and Gentiles, free people and slaves, the educated and the unschooled. How is it possible for such different people to get along with each other in one church? How could Jews who had been taught the Old Testament scriptures be friends with Greeks who had once worshipped pagan gods such as Zeus and Artemis? It only makes sense when we remember that the Holy Spirit was working in the believers' hearts. In this chapter, you will learn a little about what the religious world was like in the first century. This information is helpful because when you can imagine what the world of the early church was like, you can understand the book of Acts better. So, who was in the church? The people of the New Testament church were mostly city people. Most of Paul's ministry took place in cities, even though only a fifth of the Roman Empire's population lived in cities. At the time of the early church, Rome was the largest city that the world had ever known. There were other large cities such as Ephesus, Corinth, Antioch, and Alexandria, though they were not as huge as Rome. I'm going to take a minute there and point out something. So in the first century, the city of Rome had close to 1 million people in it. Not until London met the 1 millionth population mark in the late 18th century was there any city as large as Rome. So, taking a step back from that, Rome was huge, you guys. No city reached the population of Rome until the mid-18th century. That means hundreds of years went by, and Rome had still maintained to be one of the largest cities in history. So when we're talking about the church in Acts and we hear Rome, know that Rome was huge. It had about 1 million people in it. There were many kinds of people in Rome. And it was one of the largest cities the world had ever known. I'm moving on. In the world of the Roman Empire, everyone had his or her place in society. And the first thing to consider in knowing your place was whether you were a slave or a free person. 1 out of every 5 people was a slave. That's about 20% of the population. And for those who lived in Italy and Greece, the number was as high as 30%. Imagine you're standing in a line at a grocery store. There's a person in front of you and a person behind you. If you lived in Rome during the first century, 1 of the 3 of you would likely have been a slave. Slaves couldn't own property, get married, or have children. Slaves had no rights and were the property of their owners. Slaves on the farms had harsh lives, while the lot of the city slaves, depending on who owned them and what skills they had, were sometimes a little easier. Punishment for disobedience was severe, including instant death, but in some households, a hard-working, obedient slave could buy his or her freedom. In the church congregations, there were many who were slaves. If you were a free person, you were either a Roman citizen or not a Roman citizen. This is a second distinction, and it's a huge distinction. A Roman citizen had certain privileges and legal rights that a non-citizen did not have. This is similar to how when you're in the U.S., you have some rights. You have rights to where if you're not a citizen, you don't have some of the rights that a citizen would have. A Roman citizen had the right to vote, run for public office, and make legal contracts. When accused of a crime, a Roman citizen had the right of a fair trial, and if found guilty, he would appeal his case to a higher court all the way up to the emperor. Punishments for a Roman citizen could not include being whipped or tortured, and unless accused of treason, no Roman citizen could be given the death penalty or could be sentenced to die on a cross. Only a Roman citizen could serve as a Roman legionnaire, but a non-citizen can serve as an auxiliary soldier. After successfully serving his military time, an auxiliary soldier could become a Roman citizen. Being born as a Roman citizen had a greater status than earning citizenship later in life. If you were a Roman citizen, you were either a patrician, those who had high social standing and were wealthy, or a plebeian, an ordinary person. So, I'm going to take a moment. That was a whole lot of Roman citizen. But in the Roman Empire, if you were a citizen of Rome, you had a whole bunch of rights that maybe someone else didn't. So if you were a citizen, you couldn't necessarily be put to death. You had the right to a fair trial. You could run for public office. You could vote in the Roman Empire if you were a citizen of Rome. If you weren't, then these rights weren't necessarily yours. You may not get a fair trial if you weren't a citizen. You may not have a right to, you may have the death penalty if you weren't a citizen. There were a lot of things that you couldn't do. You couldn't vote. So these are some distinctions that are really important. Paul was a Roman citizen. So that definitely plays out in the book of Acts if you pay attention. Our next paragraph. So in the empire, there was a small group of wealthy, powerful Roman citizens, and a large part of the population that was very poor, working for a penny a day for the food they ate and sleeping either in makeshift shacks, leaning against the side of a building, or huddled outside on the narrow streets. In between the very wealthy and the very poor were the middle class, which was made up of 3 types of people, and which included approximately 1/3 of the population. First, there were the craftsmen, which were the potters, carpenters, metalworkers, and tent makers, and etc. And the merchants. Usually these men and their families lived in insula. An insula was an apartment-like dwelling with workshops and shops on the lower level and living spaces on the second floor. A successful craftsman might have several rooms for his family to live in, but poor families often all crowded into one room. Furnishings could be as few as a couple of bedrolls, a lamp or two to lessen the darkness, an earthen jar for storage, and a flat plate for each person. Because house fires were so common, people didn't cook inside the insula. Instead, they walked to a nearby popina to buy hot foods and drink for dinner. The insula buildings were built of mud bricks, stucco, or wood, with mud or brick floors. They had a central courtyard with a community well in the center and a common latrine, which is a type of toilet. Life in the insula was crowded, noisy, and smelly. A more successful craftsman or merchant might have lived in a doma, a rectangular walled structure with rooms alongside the walls and a courtyard or two at the center. His workshop would have been attached to the side of the house. Inside the wall of the front of the doma was the tulium, or office, which business took place. The doma were decorated with colorful murals, wall hangings, and curtains. Rooms would be furnished with beds, tables, and basic necessities, unlike the insulas. The second type of middle-class men were the apertores, a Latin word meaning servant. These were men who could read and write, and thus were able to work as scribes, heralds, or messengers for the civil magistrates of local government. Though these men would never be wealthy, they could advance in their positions and were pretty financially well off. The third type of middle-class men were augustals, former slaves who had been freed by their masters. These freedmen enjoyed the support of wealthy families for whom they had been slaves and had responsible jobs in shipping and manufacturing businesses owned by the families. The augustals also could be part of a group of former trusted slaves called collegium. Serving on the collegium was a one-year public service position in which the members organized religious community events and planned the annual birthday celebration for the Caesar. It was through this connection with the imperial cult of the Caesar that these freedmen received their name. The Augustals could become quite wealthy, but their social status prevented them from ever serving as a local magistrate or from having much influence in society. That was a lot. So what does all of this tell us about the makeup of the churches that Paul established? It tells us that the churches were a strange mixture of people from the middle of society. Almost none of the wealthy patrons and very few of the poorest of the poor became part of the churches. But a number of people who lived as slaves in households did become part of the church. In the church were believing Hellenistic Jews who had left Palestine years before and had made a permanent home in provinces of the Roman Empire such as Syria, Asia, Galatia, Macedonia, and Achaia. Most of these Jews were craftsmen of some type. For instance, Paul and his friends Aquila and Priscilla were tent makers. The Gentiles in the congregation were people from the middle class, some struggling to make a living and others more comfortably well off, but few considered destitute. Then there was Paul. With his education and his role as church planter, he could have received financial support from the churches or from a wealthy patron who viewed him as a philosopher worthy of being taken under his care. But Paul did neither. He supported himself as a tent maker, even though working with his hands put him in a lower social class. So, what was their world like? The Roman Empire wasn't a Christian world, but it was a religious one. One book describes the empire as a supermarket of faith. Come and take your pick of whichever gods you want to worship. In the provincial cities, shrines stood on every street corner. Temples to favorite deities sat high atop hills overlooking the city, and families put images of local gods on shelves or in cubbyholes in their homes. The Romans had an entire family of gods, and the Greeks had a different set that closely resembled the Roman gods. When the Romans conquered a city, they invited the gods of the enemy city to become part of their family of gods. Many people throughout the empire liked the mystery and glamour of the Egyptian goddess Isis so much that other than the fast-growing cult of Caesar worship, the worship of Isis was the most popular religion. The pagan Romans didn't have a book or set of laws to guide their lives of worship as the Christians did, but they did make regular animal sacrifices to the temple steps. These sacrifices were part of community-wide religious festivals that included a day off from work, free food, and entertainment. Everyone was expected to take part of the festivals, and if they didn't, well, they were just expected to. But it was impossible for Christians to join these celebrations. The purpose of these community-wide events was to celebrate the goodness of the pagan gods, and believers in Jesus couldn't participate in events that included the worship of any deity other than Jesus Christ. Because of this, the believers often faced suspicion and rejection from their neighbors. This was the culture in which the Christian believers lived. Not participating in the community's religious celebrations, not eating meat offered to idols, refusing to worship the emperor, and removing household gods from their homes. These were some of the choices that Christians had to make. These choices often resulted in losing customers at their workshops, being investigated by local authorities, and being persecuted by fearful and suspicious neighbors. So, how did they worship? In the crowded cities, as people met at workshops to conduct business or at the papinas to eat a meal, Christians talked about Jesus. At this time, Christians didn't have church buildings where they could meet. Instead, they gathered in homes. Small groups meeting in the upper room of an insula, or a large group meeting in a doma owned by a wealthier church member. When they met, they shared a simple meal, sang hymns of praise, and listened to men such as Paul, Timothy, or Apollos instructed them on the way of the Lord. The message of the gospel was attractive to the ordinary person. Christianity spoke about a personal God who loves people and gives grace. It was a religion of freedom from sin's bondage because of the sacrifice of Jesus, the Son of God. They liked the fact that Jesus Christ was a real person who had lived an ordinary life, working with his hands, and suffered in all the ways that they were suffering. They were drawn together by the love of the people who loved Jesus. So from the back streets of Ephesus and the insula of Corinth, the young church grew, and the gospel changed lives, one person and one family at a time. So that was a little bit more than we have had in our story time, but I want to highlight a couple of things. The people in the first century church had specific ways of doing things, and this comes up in the book of Acts. We can read in the book of Acts where maybe Paul got off the hook, and we wondered when maybe a Roman citizen, someone who wasn't a Roman citizen, wouldn't have gotten off the hook. There are some times Paul cut it pretty close, but Paul was a Roman citizen. And we just learned that people that were Roman citizens had a lot of rights that other people didn't. But Paul was also a tent maker. So even though he had the advantages of a Roman citizen, he lowered himself in the eyes of the people by doing work with his hands, which we learned was a very middle class thing. People who worked with their hands weren't necessarily very well respected. And we also learned that the church in the first century looked a lot different than it does today. They met in little upstairs apartments above workshops in Rome, and maybe in a doma, which was a wealthier family's home. But most often the church met in homes. And we also learned that there was a lot of suspicion among the church. We learned that because the Christians didn't participate in the religious festivals, we learned that things kind of got rough for them sometimes. These are all of the things, and there are more things that come up in the book of Acts. And the reason it's so important to learn some of this stuff is when we're reading the book of Acts and maybe reading some of Paul's letters, this is the kind of information that may help us fit ourselves in the story better. It may help us read the story better so we can understand maybe what's going on. There's a lot of things that maybe we don't understand at first read, and some of these things help fill out the story so we know who these people are and maybe what they lived like, and where the churches met, and maybe why they had such a hard time sometimes. So I hope that you enjoyed this story. We are going to learn more. I am so grateful for you all being here each week, and I hope that you're learning. I hope you're learning a lot. I hope you're learning things. I know I have learned things on this journey, and I think it's really fun. And by the time we get to Acts chapter 1, we're going to know some things, which is very exciting. So I hope that you have a great week, and I appreciate you being here, and I'll see you next week.